This video will tell the story of a megagame. What is a megagame? I'm so glad you asked. Think of something like Dungeons & Dragons, a role-playing game that lets you immerse yourself into another world, partially through some game mechanics, but mostly through the inclusion of a dungeon master, a human showrunner who can react to your decisions and tailor the game as you play. The presence of this dungeon master allows you to go way outside the usual confines of a game. You can try to do practically anything you can think of. You might not be successful, but you can at least try. Now take that Dungeons & Dragons experience, but imagine if every character in that world was another player, with their own backstory and objectives, and most importantly, their own influence on the game. Replace the single dungeon master with a full team, reacting to everyone's decisions at once, and there you have a megagame. Your story will be entangled with the stories of dozens of other people, your decisions impacting them, their decisions impacting you, and negotiation crucial for your success. This world isn't just your own adventure, it's living and breathing around you. I adore these games, and to show you why, let me tell you my story from Den of Wolves. This is the tale of a desperate man, fleeing from the burning ruins of a planet that used to be his home.
This is the RSS Shepherd, broadcasting on all open channels. Rosal has fallen. I repeat, Rosal has fallen. The wolves are in pursuit. We have no weapons. We're low on fuel. This open signal is our last resort. If anyone is out there, please, help us.
Den of Wolves is a setting roughly inspired by Battlestar Galactica. In it, 40 players will simulate a ragtag survivor fleet, and in doing so, they'll determine the very future of the human race. Right now, for every faction not named Wolf, that future even existing is far from certain. To give a little backstory here, in 2200 AD, humanity has spread to 5 planets, Earth itself of course, and its 4 former colonies, Rosal, Proxima, Glisa, and Wolf 1061c. Relations between these various planets and factions have never been great, especially between the colony planets, known as New World nations, and their former colonial overlord factions back on Earth. To try to rebuild bridges, the Interstellar Council was formed. It mostly just served as a hub for the factions to constantly argue, but in giving them a place to do that, The wars that had plagued the galaxy slowly died down, and a golden age of peace and prosperity came about. There was one faction missing from that interstellar council though. Despite repeated efforts to bring them to the table, Wolf refused the invitation, instead choosing to fully self-isolate from the rest of humanity. It was eventually accepted that Wolf would just never be part of this new galactic community. They were left to go their own way, and expected never to return. And so when they did return, nobody was prepared. It was a carefully planned blitz. Wolf agents had infiltrated various hierarchies, preparing a mass cyber attack. So with the press of a button, the Wolves knocked out every military ship in the Interstellar Navy simultaneously, leaving the planets and civilian vessels completely defenseless. Then came their armadas, attacking every fleet and every planet at once. No mercy was shown. The planets were bombarded until nothing remained, and all ships they could track were hunted down and destroyed. Our Megagame begins in the aftermath of this attack, and there remains just one beacon of hope. The ICSS Aegis was offline for repairs when the cyber attack occurs, and now stands as the last major ship in the Interstellar Navy. Sending out encrypted communications, it's managed to bring together the survivors into one single group, a ragtag assortment of ships just about capable of sustaining one another if they can work together. The Aegis is a powerful vessel equipped with heavy weaponry and can fight off wolf raids and scouting parties, but the fleet needs to stay on the move. Aegis is a capital ship, but it's a single ship nonetheless, and it's completely outmatched by the full force of the Wolf Armada currently chasing them. Humanity's fate now rests in the hands of this survivor fleet, and the Wolves, including the 3 secret Wolf operatives hidden somewhere in the fleet, will do everything in their power to bring it down. Our story will begin on the Shepherd, one of only 2 ships to survive the devastating attack on Rosal. It's the most recent arrival here and a much needed one. Shepherd is a food production vessel used for interstellar journeys, and food was a resource that the fleet previously could not generate. There is one issue though. The food synthesizers need water to function, but its water-producing sister ship was immobilized and destroyed as the Shepherd made its escape. It will need to find other sources of water in order to keep up production and feed the fleet. I begin the game on this ship, playing a lowly civil servant who has suddenly found himself the only Rosal survivor with any political experience. As such, he's been nominated as the Rosal representative to the new Interstellar Council. His job will primarily be to aid the fleet's survival, but secondarily, to protect and advance Rosal interests. The Rosal, alongside all other New World nations, have a history of feeling suppressed by this council. It was initially formed on Earth, and there's always been some degree of favoritism towards those who call Earth their home, the Old World nations. With the current political instability, maybe this is the chance to change things up. I'd be keeping an eye out for chances to do that, as well as making sure that nobody else was able to use the situation to take advantage of my people. As you can probably gather, these nations have been brought together by desperation alone. Many don't trust each other. The briefing gave me a few tips on which nations were friendly to us, primarily the other New World nations, and which nations weren't to be trusted, most notably the FAS. This was a nation that covered the entirety of North America and Europe back on Earth, and more relevant to us, used to be Rosal's colonial overlord. That title wasn't given up without a fight, and resentment is still simmering on both sides of the aisle. In a cruel twist of fate though, I would have to spend most of my time aboard their sole surviving ship, the Dion, because this gigantic luxury cruiser had been selected as the new location for the Interstellar Council's meetings. Despite having no external weaponry, it had a huge host of security forces, so was deemed a fitting compromise between comfort and security for these new politicians. That wasn't my main concern about the Council though. It's easy to miss amid all these giant colony vessels and capital ships, but hiding in this fleet is a second luxury vessel, this one far smaller. This is the personal craft of the former Secretary for Transport, the only member of the original Council's cabinet to have escaped the attack on Earth. As the last remaining elected official, he's now become the Council's president by default, and his spacecraft the official presidential vessel, carrying himself, the Vice President, and the Secretary of State. The President will have significant power over the Council's proceedings, deciding on debate topics and what to bring to vote. Thankfully for us, he's impartial, or at least he's supposed to be. In the briefing though, I was made aware that he was originally an FAS citizen, so I needed to keep a very close eye on whether he was letting that impact his judgment. But that was a worry for the future. I arrived at the venue a while before the rest of the Rosal players, and decided to first examine the Shepherd. And as it turned out, I wasn't the only one wanting to do that. Alright, so I've arrived at the Megagame. My team isn't here yet. I do have friends here, but they are all on different teams to me this time around. It's kind of interesting. This is my ship. I am aboard the Shepherd. I can move to the Endeavour, which is over there, which is also part of my team. It's done by my people, right? Yeah, some people have gotten a really good head start. We've only, it's 20 minutes until the game starts, and we've had another team come over to our table and ask us what, all our fuel requirements are and whatnot, and they all had notepads, so I'm unsure what they're gonna do with that information. But my captain wasn't here yet, like all the rest of my team I'm still waiting for, so we'll see. I just had to give them an answer in the spur of the moment, and I did show them my requirements and stuff. We'll see how everything goes. One of the rules of this megagame is that you never have to show the other teams anything, so by giving into the pressure and revealing this, I'd potentially made a major blunder immediately. I just had to hope that the players taking all these notes were planning to act in the best interests of the fleet as a whole. I didn't leave that exchange completely empty-handed though. One of them gave me some rather interesting information in return, pointing out that something I had on my table was very rare and surprisingly valuable.
So yeah, one thing I failed to mention, this little thing, is a shuttle. It's the only way to get supplies from one table to another. You have to physically carry this shuttle to them with the supplies in it, and then dock with the other ship. So for example, I could take it over to the Endeavour if I wanted to supply our science ship. This thing is really important. I thought they would be everywhere. I thought everyone would have one, but we're one of very, very few ships that has one of these. It seems like there's only 3 or so in the entire room outside the main military ship. So maybe we can use that in diplomatic leverage. I can't imagine I'll be the person mostly focused on this kind of stuff, because I'll be in the council chamber, but it could be useful for our team and in negotiations. Also, the team that was making notes on everything mentioned that we are the only team that has one of these on our side of the room, so out of the new nations, which are all kind of allied with each other. So we may need to be using that to help them. We'll see how it goes.
These shuttles represented large transport ships. In universe, each ship in the fleet had a huge number of 1 or 2 person vessels docked in their hangars, each with no room for cargo. In game, that meant you could freely walk to the tables that represented other players' ships. Thematically, you'd just be taking one of these small personal spacecraft, and there would always be enough to do that. However, if you wanted to move any resource or bring security personnel or engineers or anything similar, you would need to place them in a shuttle and physically bring that shuttle with you. As such, the shuttles are incredibly valuable. Not long after this, the Shepherd's crew arrived and the game finally began. I had a little time before the first Interstellar Council meeting would be called, so I had a discussion with them about what they'd want me to push for. To put it mildly, they were very skeptical. They didn't think that the formal politics would really matter during what was clearly an emergency situation. However, that illusion was very quickly shattered once the president circulated the meeting's agenda, because the chosen topic was passing laws around resource distribution. And as the only source of food in the entire fleet, the Shepherd currently had a massive amount of diplomatic leverage. They asked me to ensure, by any means necessary, that we didn't lose our control over the food supply. I travelled to the council chamber aboard the Dion once the session was called, and almost as soon as I got there, I heard the shout from fleet control. Wolf attack. A wolf scouting party, perhaps tracking the Shepherd's last jump, had found the fleet. Crews aboard those few ships that had weapon batteries went straight to battle stations, ready to protect the civilian ships around them. Several ships launched fighter squadrons to intercept. The civilian vessels themselves readied their security teams, preparing to repel any boarders. And I did nothing. Mechanically, the rule during a wolf attack is that you can't leave the ship you're currently on. Whatever table you're at or room you're in when the attack is declared, you must stay there. Launching an unshielded personal craft during this time would mean almost certain death. That meant I was stuck on the Dion, sat in the council chamber with the other council members. We weren't capable of doing anything to help, so we decided to start the council session anyway. The first time this happened was a really surreal experience. Physically, the council chamber was in a room around the corner from the main hall, meaning we could hear the battle playing out, but we couldn't see it. In that hall, the entire fleet was working together to repel the attack, fighting side by side with one another. But in this room, the fight wasn't going to be against the wolves. It was going to be against one another. The first to speak was the council member from Gleesa. Gleesa was a New World nation, a colony planet initially settled for its rich presence of strithium ore, an ore that can be refined into FTL fuel, necessary for FTL jumps. Their sole surviving ship is Refinery 124, purpose-built for that refining process, although it can't mine the strithium itself. My pre-game brief had informed me that Gleesa was the closest thing Rosal had to an ally. Our nations had a strong history of working together and would often back one another up in the council, so I was very ready to hear what this council member had to say. When they spoke, they immediately pointed to the wolf attack outside. This was just a small scouting party, but what if the next attack was the Armada? We needed to be able to flee, and for that we needed the fuel that Refinery 124 could provide. For their fuel production to be at max capacity, they said they needed to have a steady source of strithium ore and a steady supply of water to refine that ore. Although there were several sources of water production in the fleet, there was only one ship which could provide that strithium: Icebreaker. This ship belonged to the CPA, an old world nation which covered much of Asia and Oceania back on Earth, and was designed specifically to mine asteroids. Historically, they're not too fond of Gleesa, but the situation now meant that these two factions would have to work closely together, otherwise the fleet would not be able to stay on the move. Gleesa's pitch was a very strong one and had everyone in the room convinced. A law declaring that Refinery 124 would be guaranteed all the strithium ore Icebreaker could provide, as well as 12 water per turn to refine it, passed easily. In retrospect, perhaps a little too easily. The strithium itself wasn't a problem, there was no other use for it except to make fuel, but the 12 water was far more than the refinery's fair share, and we all knew that. With the wolves at the door though, fuel had to be a priority. Surely it was better to give them what they needed than risk needing to leave a ship behind if we had to make an emergency jump. What we didn't know at the time was that we were being deceived. Gleesa's councillor had been sent with instructions to do anything he could to increase his own ship's morale, and was lying through his teeth to achieve that, because Refinery 124 didn't actually require any water to refine that ore. Effectively, what we just legislated was that Refinery would get a huge portion of the total water supply to do whatever they wanted with, which turned out to be distributing it directly to its passengers. Everyone else would then have to fight over what little water was left. Of course, we were all in blissful ignorance about this. In the moment, we were just overjoyed that we'd managed to work together to pass a law that would supposedly help everyone. We then moved to the president's proposal. Resource distribution needed to be formalized, he said. As it was, every ship was having to send people out to barter with the various suppliers, and that wasn't in the best interest of the fleet, especially when much of a phase could be lost to a wolf attack at any time. That would leave a horde sprinting to the supply ships after the attack was repelled to get what they needed before the end of the phase. We all agreed with him in principle. We did not all agree on the same solution. This would become a bit of a running theme. The president's suggestion was that ICSS Aegis as an international and impartial vessel be placed in charge of all resource distribution. This was completely unacceptable to me, as it would take away Rosal's control of the food, and I could feel that most other people there weren't in favour of it either. However, no one was initially speaking out against it, perhaps everyone looking to someone else to make the first move against the president. So I decided to spark the resistance myself with one simple question. Do we really want the military having even more power over us than they already do? Not only did all the other councillors immediately jump on this argument and back it up, even the president seemed concerned by this thought. We all knew that the council's control over the fleet was something of an illusion. We had nothing to back it up except collective agreement. The Aegis's power, on the other hand, was very obviously real. They had weapons. Even without using those weapons against us, they were still the defenders of the fleet, the heroes. Everyone relied on them for their very survival. The only real reason they couldn't take over our role was because the fleet would reject the dictatorship. But if they showed prowess in resource distribution as well, would that still be the case? We all collectively agreed that it wasn't a good idea to find out. Instead, we eventually agreed that there would be 3 separate distributors, one for food, one for water, and one for both fuel and ore. These 3 distributors would have the power to examine everyone's supplies of their resource type and requisition for distribution anything they thought was excessive. These would be extremely powerful roles for those who gave them. The rules of the game stated that the ships never had to give away or even show their resources unless they themselves decided to. But one of the fascinating things about the Interstellar Council was that the laws we passed could override certain game rules, and in this case, they would. Obviously, it then became absolutely vital to me that the Rosal gain the food distributor role. If someone else did, not only would we lose out on that benefit, we'd entirely lose control of our sole resource. So when a really quite reasonable point was raised, that in order to avoid hoarding, the distributor should be from a different ship to the one that primarily supplied that resource, I instantly pushed back hard. I didn't really have great arguments against this, but I didn't need them. 5 out of the 6 council members here represented factions that produced some kind of resource, and most of those council members were happy to back any point that meant they didn't lose control of it. In the end, I got my wish. The law we eventually passed listed a crew member from the Shepherd as the food distributor. I was over the moon with this, because not only had I retained control of food for my faction, I'd actively given them even more control over it, with the ability to take back any food that other factions had. As you might expect, the other 2 distributor roles went to the 2 factions whose councillors fought hardest for them in the meeting. The one for water went to a crew member from the Lucas. Now the Lucas was a water supply ship belonging to the SAN, an old world nation made up of a union of countries covering South America back on Earth. Notably, the distributor role didn't override the law we passed earlier in the phase. They had complete control over the water supply, but they were still obligated to provide Refinery 124 its guaranteed 12 water per turn. And in fact, Refinery 124 came out as the single biggest winner here, because the third distributor role went to them. They now had guaranteed water well in excess of what they needed, and complete control over the fleet's ore and fuel supply. In retrospect, it's completely ridiculous that this passed, but in the moment I wasn't paying attention to that. I was just happy that I'd secured the food role. This distribution law had, maybe surprisingly, passed completely unanimously, despite it meaning that two supply ships had just lost control over the resources they were supplying. The first of these was the Icebreaker, producing strithium ore that would immediately be under the control of the refinery, but that's perhaps reasonable given we'd already passed a law that strithium ore would go to the refinery. The other was the Quellon, a New World Nation ship from the last of the 6 factions in the game, Proxima. Proxima was in an odd place in the pre-game briefing, because despite technically being aligned with the other New World nations, they historically were very isolationist, independent, and pushed for their own goals rather than mutual ones, so Gleesa and Rosal both don't feel that much of an alignment to them. It's possibly because of this that their council member decided to give up control of her resource, water, in order to gain favour with the other factions. While we were voting on that resolution, the Wolf attack was declared over. In all the politicking, I'd almost forgotten it was still happening. The end of the attack meant literally nothing in the council, we just continued our meeting. And in doing so, we moved on to the final topic on the president's agenda, one that he hadn't circulated prior, and which ended up being a rather nasty surprise to me. The issue of the shuttles. The problem, the president said, was that the shuttles were very limited, and in order to distribute the resources, we would need designated shuttles for each of them, requisitioned by the state for that purpose. If you remember from the pre-game, the Shepherd had one of these shuttles, and I was determined to hang on to it. On the face of it, this proposal shouldn't really be an issue, because we were the food distributor. We could simply designate the Shepherd's shuttle as the official food transport and keep control of it. But what I was worried about though, was that if the tables ever turned on me in the council, this single law would rip out all of the Shepherd's control with one motion. Just by redesignating the food distributor, we would lose our food and our shuttle. Basically all of our leverage would be gone. I wasn't sure how to deal with this at the time, but I was saved by one simple factor. The president didn't know who had the shuttles. As he asked about it, the other 2 councillors with shuttles put theirs forward, and as we talked about how we needed a third, I did not mention the one that was docked with the Shepherd. I stayed totally silent. After some debate about whether to requisition the Aegis' shuttles for this, it was instead decided that water and food would just share the same designated shuttle, requisitioned from the Lucas. After passing this into law, the council adjourned and I returned to my ship, ready to tell them about my incredible success. But I returned to devastation. The Wolf attack had been a small one, but its entire focus had been the Shepherd. Several boarding ships had managed to dock, and the Shepherd security forces were very nearly overwhelmed. While they did just about manage to fight off the invaders, it wasn't before the Wolves had destroyed our fuel storage and half of our food synthesizers. My crew was still happy to hear about my success in the council though. It was good to have a little good news. And immediately they designated the first officer as the food distributor, who decided to use the Shepherd's own shuttle for it, despite it not being the officially designated one. But they also pointed out that after these attacks, there was almost no food for them to distribute. As I returned to the council in the following phase, I had one very clear instruction from them: make sure they repair our ship. Getting into the council chamber in the first place turned out to be an unexpected obstacle. Protests had begun right outside it, with the Dion's residents claiming they had little food or water and weren't being prioritized. After an executive decision by the president, the council members were covertly escorted to a different room on the ship. The moment the council finally began, I hijacked proceedings. I showed photos of the devastation on my ship, made a point of how food was vital for the fleet and our production was practically halted, and asked the President and the Council, please, to help. They all agreed in principle. They disagreed with my proposed solution. We needed 12 materials and 3 engineers to fully repair the ship, and I asked that it be ensured that we get that, similar to how Refinery 124 was being ensured 12 water. But now that a round had passed, people had realized just how scarce these resources were, and I faced heavy pushback from everyone. We can try to prioritize your repairs, they said, but we can't guarantee anywhere near as much as you're asking for. Trying to find some other motivation for them to help, I pointed out that helping repair the food synthesizers would be great PR for everyone on the council, something you'd think would convince most politicians, but which didn't really move anyone at all. So, without thinking, I said something very unwise. Imagine if those rioters hear on the news that we could have fixed the food production and you all decided not to. I instantly felt the room ice over, as what had been a merely non-committal group turned outright hostile. It was clear I'd gone a step too far, and I immediately backed down. Thankfully, the representative for the CPA was quite a nice guy, and made an informal agreement with me that his ship, the Icebreaker, would do what they could to help. But it was very clear that if any kind of legislation or guarantee had been on the table before, it certainly wasn't anymore. I returned to the Shepherd very dejected, ready to give them the bad news, only to find that engineers from the Icebreaker were already on board, having repaired our fuel storage and a good number of the food synthesizers before the council member had even returned to tell them about this deal. What's more, they asked for absolutely nothing in return. It was a stark reminder that we weren't enemies here, and sometimes a little bit of ship-to-ship conversation could be much more effective than trying to force something through Parliament. During this phase, I decided to take advantage of a special rule that applied to only 3 players in this entire game, myself included. For every other player, provided you were able to travel there, the team phase was a time where you were required to return to your own ship. This is primarily a mechanic to allow you to catch up with your teammates, who, due to the various roles, will have been doing something completely different to you. However, there are 3 players in this game who are technically crew members of more than one ship, and during the team phase, these players can go to any ship they represent, assuming it's possible for them to do so. The first of these 3 is the council member for the SAN, who's primarily based on the Lucas, but who also represents a much smaller second SAN ship called the Salvador. This is a medical vessel containing trained personnel and a medbay that will be extremely useful as the game progresses. Likewise, the council member for Proxima represented both the major Proxima ship, the water-producing supply ship Quellon, and a secondary Proximan vessel called the Vulcan. The Vulcan's very presence in the fleet is a controversial one, because it's a prison transport ship, and it was en route when the attack on Proxima occurred, meaning that there's still a large number of criminals on board. The ship does have a massive upside for the fleet though, which is that aside from the Aegis, it's the only ship to have weapon batteries. It was very active in repelling that first Wolf scouting party. Finally, there's me. The Shepherd wasn't the only ship to escape the attack on Rosal. A second, much smaller vessel called the Endeavour travelled alongside it, also joining the survivor fleet. This ship is a research vessel, and comes equipped with huge amounts of scientific equipment and massive laboratories, something that could be of huge benefit to the fleet. However, Endeavour only had a skeleton crew on board when it managed to make the jump, and so had serious manpower problems. Up until this point I'd been focused on the Shepherd, but I now thought that Shepherd was in good enough shape that I could go and visit Endeavour. So I went over and chatted to them, and they had a very interesting idea of how their manpower problem could be solved.
Okay, so it's now at the end of turn 2. In the first turn, we managed to pass resolutions about shuttle requisitioning, but we kept our shuttle protected. It was the other shuttles that got given. The other one, they were planning to try and put someone on the Aegis in charge of food of all resource redistribution. There was no way I was going to let that one pass, right? So I fought quite hard against that. And it ended up being that someone from the ship that had the resource would be in charge of distributing that resource, which is essentially what it was anyway, so we just kept the status quo on that one. This last round, my ship got attacked massively and pretty horribly by the wolves. I spent the entire time trying to campaign for basically people to be forced to repair our ship, because we're the only food producers, right? The rest of the council were not very happy with that one, so I kind of complained to the press about it a little bit. We'll see how that works. Meanwhile, my other research ship wants me to get the president to raise the possibility of recruiting prisoners as scientists, which sounds like a terrible idea for me, but they're the scientists, so I guess they know how it works.
Endeavour had been desperately running recruiting campaigns around the fleet with the slogan, "Anyone can be a scientist." But this had fallen pretty flat, and they needed a new strategy. They hoped that by releasing prisoners into the workforce, they could find and train some much needed recruits. To say I was concerned about the prospect of releasing prisoners would be an understatement. But the Endeavour's crew were insistent that I try, and at the end of the day, they were Rosal and my job was to represent their interests. When I returned to the council, I asked the president whether that item could be added to the agenda, at which point he chuckled and showed me that it was already there. The Endeavour's crew weren't the only ones with manpower problems, it turned out, and Vulcan was looking like an attractive solution to multiple people. Once we started the meeting, we heard the alarm. Wolf attack. But this time we didn't even pause to listen. It was clear these were going to be frequent events, and with nothing we could personally do about them, our job was just to focus on the council session. It didn't feel surreal this time. The battles raging outside were slowly becoming normal. The first item on the agenda was jump coordinates. As it stood, the Aegis was sending out scout ships to find potential locations to jump to, but right now, there was no formal process for deciding which to go with. In the end, we came up with the plan that the Aegis would present 3 options to us in the council would then vote on the destination, and then the Aegis would be in charge of distributing those coordinates throughout the fleet. This passed without any issue, and when the Admiral brought us options, we unanimously voted on an Ice Asteroid field. This was particularly attractive given that the water supplies in the fleet were running very low on every ship not named Refinery 124. The president then raised the matter of recruiting prisoners, and that took the majority of this council session to discuss. To my surprise, almost everyone was in favour. Apparently manpower was a massive issue all around, enough to make most councillors overlook the potential dangers of releasing prisoners into the fleet. The concerns weren't completely discounted though. The councillor for the SAN offered to have his medical ship, Salvador, carry out psychiatric checks on prisoners prior to their release. It would slow down the influx of new crew members, but it should provide some layer of safety to the plan. We passed this into law, by which point the wolf attack had been successfully repelled and the council was adjourned. Endeavour were over the moon to hear about the prisoner law, but the Shepherd was now facing issues again. Every ship's crew was clamoring at their door for food, and they couldn't even get close to meeting demand. It wasn't a problem with the food synthesizers being damaged, most of them were now back online, but to operate them required water. Water that the Shepherd just wasn't receiving. The crew suspected some kind of foul play from the water distributor from the Lucas. Something I wasn't sure we had any proof for. The distributors seemed like very easy targets for frustration over scarcity, but they seemed very convinced, so I returned to the council with that in mind. But when I entered the council chamber, I discovered that it was me who was about to face a rough meeting. As much as I'd love to claim that that was on instinct, it wasn't. The councillor from Proxima often brought notes from her crew into the room, and she was never particularly careful about keeping them concealed. And this time, one was laying face up on the table right in front of her. I saw the word Shepherd on it and quickly snapped a photo as I went to sit down, reading it back on my phone afterwards. Shepherd needs to lose its food auditor role. That was a problem. Thankfully, the president was very insistent on going over his own agenda before anything else could be raised. The last wolf attack, he said, had given him a revelation. We were aimless, fighting to survive in the moment with no goal to head towards. If we find that goal, it could both guide our path and give the fleet some desperately needed morale. He wanted to begin a research project to find a long-term solution, somewhere we could actually escape to and not be found by the Wolf forces. That would involve scouting locations and simulating the likelihood of wolves finding them, so would need to be a joint project between the Aegis, which had the scouts, and the Endeavour, which had the scientific equipment required to run these simulations. There was unanimous agreement in the room that this was a great idea, and I quickly took a trip back out to the Endeavour to check with the crew that they were capable of doing this. Something they were very happy to accept, especially as the council was promising them manpower and materials if they did it. As I was at their ship though, I also asked about what research it might interrupt, wondering if it could put something important on hold. At which point the captain laughed and said it might delay the invention of space beer. Assuming he was just joking, I laughed that off and returned to the council chamber, giving the thumbs up. The proposal was passed unanimously, and the president immediately left the room to go talk to the News Corporation. This was a group of players who would travel from ship to ship and compile a news report that would be played to the entire fleet at the end of each turn. To a politician, this news broadcast was of course incredibly important, especially in the state of flux the council was currently in. We all knew there might be elections at some point, and pretty much every council member had tried to get the political correspondents to publish their accomplishments or slander their opponents on the council. What we'd universally found was that this political correspondent player would act very interested and write notes while we were talking to him, and then would subsequently not mention anything we had said, instead choosing to focus on things he'd observed in the council chamber, most often things that none of us particularly wanted in the news. However, this proposal got special treatment. The president was able to convince the News Corporation that instead of having their political correspondents summarize it, they should have the president directly announce the news on the broadcast. He claimed that he was doing this to boost the fleet's morale, but there was a notable shift in the attitudes in the council chamber after we found out about it. He would get all of the credit now, and a clear popularity boost, and in hushed conversations many of us wondered whether that had been the idea behind this whole thing all along. But with food and water rations low, morale was indeed badly needed, and if the president getting a boost in the polls lessened our chances of riots on the ships just a little, it was probably worth it. Not to mention, the plan itself was a good idea, and from a personal perspective, it meant my science ship was now being prioritized for the resources they very badly needed. However good or bad it was, I wasn't thinking about it for long, because then came the moment I'd been dreading. The representative for Proxima finally spoke up, and exactly as her note had indicated, she stated that the Shepherd needed its food distributor role revoked. She said that her ships were on the brink of riots, and that was due to us not distributing food fairly. I decided that the best solution was going hard on the attack against the water distributor from the Lucas. My argument was that the Shepherd had the food synthesizers standing by, but we couldn't run them. We weren't being prioritized for water supply. There just wasn't enough food to go around, and if anyone wanted more, we were going to need more water. The councillor for the Lucas instantly defended his water distributor, saying they were doing their very best, but they had to keep Refinery 124 supplied or else the fuel production would stop. You might remember that Refinery 124 didn't actually need this water for refining, and were instead just giving it to their occupants to keep their own ship's morale high, something we were all still in the dark about. However, at this moment, the Gleeser councillor finally came to his senses. Realizing that his own selfishness was dooming the fleet, starving the very ships that Refinery relied upon, he admitted to what he'd done. We forgave him and redistributed the water, and everyone lived happily ever after. Except no. None of that happened. The Gleaser Councillor listened to what was going on, the accounts of starvation, the accusations thrown at the Lucas, thrown at the Shepherd, knowing that he could solve all of this, and stayed completely silent. And in fact, this was somehow even worse than it seemed. Do you remember that offhand comment from the captain of my science ship, the Endeavour, about the interrupted research being space beer? As it turned out, Refinery had been claiming to also be dangerously low on morale. They had gone to the Endeavour and asked it to research a method for turning their water into space beer, something that they then took and kept for themselves to raise their own ship's morale even higher. But in this meeting, all the blame for the fleet's problems fell on Shepherd and Lucas. Before anything could be passed, however, we ran out of time and had to adjourn. I returned once again to the Shepherd.
Okay, so turn 4 now. We managed to get the prisoners getting retrained as crew thing passed. This last round, though, I came under very, very heavy pressure to give up my food, the control of the food, because people think we aren't distributing it fairly. As far as I can tell, we are, and we have very little ourselves, so it seems a bit problematic. The other thing that happened was we are starting a research project on the Endeavour to try and find where to go to. So hopefully that means they'll be prioritized more.
Something I failed to mention in my report at this point was just how angry my crewmates were getting. They had been to talk to the crew of the Lucas to try and guarantee that enough of the water supply made it to the food synthesizers, and they were given the same excuse that I was given in the council meeting. Refinery 124 needed the water. Lucas were already giving us as much as they possibly could. But Lucas made a big mistake while they were making this claim. Under the rules of the game, players can't look at another ship's supplies if that ship conceals them. This could be overwritten by law, and we had overwritten this by law, but only in the case of distributors looking at the resource they were distributing. The Shepherd's food distributor could only look at food, and the only player who could look at the Lucas's water supply was the water distributor, who was himself from the Lucas. A perfect situation to enable them to never show their water supply to anyone. However, during this conversation, their crew had forgotten to conceal their supplies, leaving a huge stack of water tokens openly visible on their table. A huge stack that during the entire turn never seemed to make its way off the Lucas. As it turned out, Refinery 124 was not the only ship cheating the fleet. The reason water had been so scarce, and as a result food too, was that after supplying Refinery each round, Lucas had been holding back most of the remainder to keep its own morale high. Unfortunately, my crew was so obsessed by this discovery that they didn't start distributing the little food they did manage to generate until way too late in the phase, and some ships like the Icebreaker and the Dion actually received no food at all. As you can imagine, these ships were not happy about this turn of events, and in their eyes, the blame fell squarely on the Shepherd for not getting the food out. I knew this upcoming council would be tough, and I told my crew as much, to which the first officer made a really good suggestion. He asked that I propose we trade distributor roles with the Lucas, so the Shepherd controlled water and the Lucas controlled food. It was a brilliant proposal. It would give us permission to take the Lucas's water and stop them from hoarding it, which would enable us to make as much food as we could, and if the Lucas attempted to hoard the food instead, the blame would fall on them rather than the finger always being pointed at us. With that in mind, I returned to the council and proposed exactly that. I immediately faced strong opposition, not just from the councilman from the Lucas, but also the councillor from Refinery 124. He repeatedly stated that he didn't trust the Shepherd to fulfill the obligation from round 1 of supplying Refinery with the 12 guaranteed water to create fuel, suggesting we'd always prioritize our own food instead. I found myself almost completely alone in this fight. The councillors for the Dion and Icebreaker were understandably annoyed at the lack of food last round, so they were completely unwilling to back me. My only potential ally here was the councillor for Proxima, a very unlikely one because she was the same councillor who had brought that note in the previous round. But to my surprise, an ally she was. Well, not exactly an ally, but she viewed me as an enemy of her enemy, because in the meantime, her crew had carried out an investigation into the Lucas too, and found exactly what we had. The Lucas had enormous water supplies and was keeping them back to raise its own morale. It was even more offensive to her than it was to me though, because her main ship, the Quellon, was itself a water producer, water that was being produced and then immediately being taken by the Lucas because they had the water distribution role. Her people were literally dying of thirst on a ship that was producing water. It's no wonder they were so close to riots. She announced this to the whole room, but the Lucas's councillor fought back hard, and the councillor for Refinery 124 kept backing him to the hilt. Bear in mind that at this stage we had no idea Refinery was complicit in all this, so their word really meant something. The ensuing negotiations went around in circles until the phase was almost over, and it seemed like nothing was going to be accomplished, at which point, seemingly out of desperation just to get something done, the tables turned on me. The Proxima councillor suddenly brought the discussion back around to the Shepherd and our food distributor role. Despite her taking our side against the Lucas, she still wanted our role removed too, having seen me push hard for that distributor role in round 1 and now not trusting any player who did that. Knowing that there was no way I'd win a vote to keep it at this stage, I tried to make one final stand, telling the council once again that the issues were due to the Shepherd not getting the water it needed, and that as things stood, the fleet was gonna starve, regardless of who distributed the little food we could make. And at that point, the Proxima councillor suggested a very shrewd deal. Shepherd needed water, and the Quellon produced water that was currently under the control of the Lucas. She suggested that instead, the Quellon supply the Shepherd with all the water it needed directly, and in return, the role of the food distributor would be taken from the Shepherd and given to one of the crew of the Quellon. This was, of course, not anything close to what my crew had wanted, but I knew at this point that we were being stripped of that distributor role no matter what. I had zero support here, and the deal was something of a lifeline, something the council would accept that at least had some upside. I accepted it, it was voted through, and I braced myself for the frustration I was about to hear from my crewmates. And indeed, when I returned to the ship, there was frustration aplenty. They'd sent me out with the goal of swapping our distributor role for a different one, and instead, I'd come back having given it away and seemingly gotten nothing in return except a vague promise from the Quellon. I hadn't even managed to wrestle the water distributor role away from the Lucas, the people we knew for a fact were actually cheating the fleet. There was one single small win in all this, because although the food distribution had been using our shuttle, that shuttle wasn't officially requisitioned. When the Quellon came to ask about it, we hid it, and claimed that we'd been timesharing the one from the Lucas, as the law had stated. They then started doing exactly that, and we ended up keeping control of our own shuttle. But it was one tiny upside, amid an apparent massive loss. There was no time to dwell on it though. The Aegis had sent out a signal. We'd been in this spot too long, and the Wolf Armada was nearly upon us. It was finally time to FTL jump. All of the crews had been made aware of this at the start of the round, so all ships had their FTL stations manned and the coordinates for the Ice Asteroid field entered. One by one, the ships warped away around us, and I took a deep breath as the Shepherd's turn came, hoping that nothing would go wrong. As suddenly as we departed, we arrived to see the massive Ice Asteroids. Mission accomplished. The remainder of the ships jumped in around us, and we could all breathe a sigh of relief as we'd managed to make the first warp of the game without any issue. That was, until Control announced that the Star Alpha was no longer with us. We waited for the President's ship to warp in, hoping that they'd just gotten delayed in some way, but it very soon became apparent that they were not going to arrive. The President, the Vice President, and the Secretary of State were lost somewhere in the void of space. Unsure of what to do, I approached the Councillor for the CPA aboard the Icebreaker to discuss what could have happened. And that was when the alarm sounded. Wolf attack. Mere hours after we'd jumped in, a wolf scouting party had found us. I was trapped aboard the Icebreaker amid the battle, and this was the first time I'd actually been in the room and had been able to directly watch the response to the attack. It was incredible to me how quickly these captains leapt into action, but this was of course now their third time reacting to one of these. They'd had plenty of practice. While the combat ensued, I talked over the situation more with the CPA Councillor. He pointed out that the Aegis had been responsible for giving out the coordinates to the fleet, and he was suspicious. Without the President, the Interstellar Council could be thrown into chaos, but more than that, the Council was already operating on questionable legitimacy, and without the President, that legitimacy could be questioned even more. His theory was that the presidential vessel had been deliberately given the wrong coordinates in order to lay the foundations for a military coup. That logic did seem sound to me, but my own theory had been the exact opposite. The wolves had attacked immediately after our jump, which gave me suspicions that someone who had seen the coordinates might be working with the wolves. If you knew that a wolf attack was about to occur, perhaps because you'd called one in, it made sense to jump to a different location, avoid the conflict, and then suddenly find the fleet after the battle was over, when the risk of damage to your own ship was zero. We agreed that both of these were possibilities, or perhaps it had just been a genuine mistake. Whatever the case, it was important that we investigate why it happened. Given the current president was lost in the void, an acting president would need to be elected, so I agreed to support the election of the CPA councilman in order to allow him to order that investigation. I'm not sure this aligned with my initial objectives of advocating for the Rosal, particularly voting an old world councillor into a power position when my brief had said the old world was suppressing us, but the Icebreaker had been an extremely selfless ship. It had come to our aid when we needed it in round 2. This felt like a time where what was best for the fleet needed to be put ahead of personal interests, and I trusted the Icebreaker to do that.
Yes, can you explain what just happened to the president?
Well, they got lost. Their ship basically, for some reason, is not with the rest of the fleet, so we have everyone here except for the head honchos.
Yeah, so what do you think happened?
There's a lot of rumors going around, but I'm not gonna... There is like a possibility that the military gave the wrong coordinates to them, or a mistake happened, or actually they wanted to leave. So we're gonna ask for a full report to understand what has happened, because we need to understand if the fleet is breaking apart.
Yes. And specifically, we're gonna try and get you elected president, right?
Yes.
So that you can...
So I can actually force that, as we have like the best... how can I put it? Intentions to get everyone into their place. We've helped a lot during the entire time. We've been providing resources, so we need to understand what just happened.
Yes, exactly. I should explain why I'm here talking to you right now. There has just been a wolf attack while I was here talking to the ship. So I was technically on board this ship when the wolves attacked, so I'm stuck here for now, right?
Yeah, well, we have plenty of high-quality accommodation for you.
You don't seem to have very much food.
No, and that's your role to give us.
All right, well, we'll see how this goes. Thank you.
Sounds good.
After the wolf attack was declared over, we entered the council chamber for a very rushed council meeting. The council member from the Dion wasn't in this meeting because he was confined to the medical ship, recovering from injuries sustained in the wolf attack, and we decided to just proceed without him. The first to speak was the council member for Gleeser, mentioning that one of his refinery stations had been destroyed by a planted bomb right before the jump had occurred. His own crew was carrying out an investigation, so it didn't need council attention, but it was confirmation that Wolf operatives were indeed present in the fleet. Following this, we started to discuss the election of that acting presidency. With the Wolf attack delaying the council meeting, we all knew there wasn't much time in this phase, and quickly decided that this election needed to be an internal one, between just the present council members. As per my deal, I put forward the council member from the Icebreaker for the position, saying that the Icebreaker had shown the kind of selflessness we needed leading the council at a time like this. Both the other council members from the New World, Glisa and Proxima, looked at me like I was insane. They didn't say this part out loud, but it was very clear what was going through their heads. The FSA Councillor was injured and out of the meeting. The New World nations had a majority right here, right now. They saw a chance to snatch control away from those Earth factions, and they were watching as I threw that chance away. They both instantly tried to convince me not to do it. The Councillor for the Quellon did this in a particularly funny way. She said that the Shepherd had been showing that same kind of selfless leadership, in being willing to give up our food distributor role the round before for the good of the fleet, and that she would prefer to elect me as acting president instead. It was so blatantly untrue, I was forced into giving up that distributor role. But the truth didn't matter here. Glisa quickly got behind it, which meant that if I switched my own vote, I would win the acting presidency no matter what. It was a pitch specifically designed to appeal to my own greed. I'd love to say that I stood by my morals and refused it, but I can't. I could see the look of betrayal in the CPA councilman's eyes as I gave in to temptation, switched, and elected myself. What little time we had left in the meeting was focused on the issue of information security. The Proxima Councillor mentioned that everyone on her ship had been told the jump location, and that didn't seem safe to her. Most of us were very confused about this, because on our ships only the captains had been given that information, and we thought that was the norm. We decided to enact a law ensuring that, saying that nobody except the Aegis and the captains could know the coordinates, even us on the council. Aegis would still present us with the 3 options, but the Admiral would tell us only the types of location, not where they were. This passed easily, and we then adjourned the council meeting. As I was returning to my ship, Council Control, the game master who was running the council section of the game, came to me to remind me that anyone in the president role was expected to be completely impartial. As such, if I returned to the Shepherd to discuss council issues with my crew, that could be considered improper conduct. In that moment, I shrugged it off, telling them that I'd deal with the consequences of it at the next council meeting. I returned to the Shepherd, surprised to, for once, find my crew actually happy. The Quellon had done a really good job, it turned out, and for the first time in the game, the ship had actually obtained the water it needed to generate enough food to feed the fleet. It wasn't a high morale amount of food, but it was at least enough to quell some of the riots that were looking more and more likely on various ships. All the bad feeling about me having given up that role seemed to have completely vanished. I was obviously really happy about this, but on the flip side, it made me feel really guilty for having just screwed over the Icebreaker's Councillor in that last meeting for my own gain. The fleet was actually starting to work together to coalesce to overcome the selfishness that had been crippling it, and everyone was benefiting as a result. If there was ever a moment where putting myself first felt inappropriate, it was this one. So I decided to take action. When I returned to the council chambers, to the absolute horror of my fellow New World councillors, I immediately stood down from the acting presidency. I then proposed we should elect a completely neutral acting president, the council controller himself, representing a civil servant, in the hope that we could all work together on passing legislation without any of us playing for our own political gain. Seeing that I wasn't going to be convinced otherwise, and that I wouldn't vote for either of them, Proxima and Glisa both eventually conceded to this, and it went through with no issue. The council controller then took the chair, but without any direction on what the acting president should be doing, they did very little. In fact, the council basically eliminated the president role there and then. Previously, he'd been setting the agenda and calling votes. Now the agenda was made upon the fly by councillors speaking their proposals to the room, and we voted when everyone felt ready to vote. It wasn't a particularly fair system because the naturally louder council members often got many more of their proposals to the table, but it did function, and that was all it needed to do. The Proxima Councillor immediately went on the aggressive with the first proposal here. The Lucas still had control of water distribution and its morale was still at maximum. Last time nothing had resulted from her raising this, but this time something was different. As the council member for the Lucas tried to defend and deflect once again, the council member for Gleesa suddenly wasn't backing him. With nobody on Lucas's side, a resolution quickly passed to transfer control of water distribution from the Lucas to the Icebreaker. Notably, Refinery 124's 12 water per turn deal was specifically re-guaranteed in this new amendment, which was probably the deal that Proxima struck with Gleesa. Even with Refinery hoarding extra resources though, the fact that Lucas no longer could meant that the water situation across the entire fleet dramatically improved after this point. I was quickly called away from the meeting at this point by the captain of the Endeavour. Their ship had been scanning for long-distance communications to try and locate the president, and they had just had a breakthrough. They picked up a very faint message from the Star Alpha. Unfortunately, the message simply stated that they were running out of food and water. It didn't give any coordinates or anything useful to locate them, but the Endeavour was going to try and run a trace to figure out where that signal had originated from. I rushed back into the meeting with the news that the president was confirmed to be alive, at exactly the same time as the council member for Gleesa was introducing a vote of no confidence in that very same president. Now, votes of no confidence on the Interstellar Council depose the president with a 2/3 majority. They're a specific game rule and game mechanic. Gleesa's reasoning for proposing one was that A, the president wasn't here to lead and we had no indication as to when he would return. B, the president was never elected president in the first place, he had just been assigned that role as the last survivor of the previous Interstellar Council's cabinet. And C, the president had mishandled issues earlier in the game, although they were very vague on what these issues actually were. The reasons themselves didn't really seem designed to convince anyone, in my opinion. It was clearly just feeling out who would be willing to see the official presidency change hands. Proxima was immediately on board with this, and very surprisingly, the FAS was too, despite the president being their citizen. According to my objective, I should probably have been on board as well, but I just had that news from the Endeavour. I pushed back against the proposal, arguing that deposing the president while the president wasn't even here would be a really bad luck for the council. If we knew that the Star Alpha was lost forever, then yes, replacing him was obviously a necessity. But we knew that he was alive. Endeavour was actively trying to find him. Bringing him back could be the huge morale boost we needed for the fleet. Yet again, my New World compatriots were extremely frustrated that I was hampering their plans, but as we made our positions clear, it was very evident that the 2/3 majority wouldn't be reached. The Icebreaker and Lucas both took my side on this one, leaving them one vote short of being able to depose him. I exited the council chamber and went to talk to the Rosal about this. The Shepherd's crew very strongly thought I'd made the wrong move, pointing out the president was an FAS citizen himself and the FAS was our rival. We should take our chance to depose him. Trying to get a second opinion, I travelled to the Endeavour. But before I could even mention this, the Endeavour's captain told me that they were breaking the law and needed my help. Taken aback, I asked why, and his reply changed the entire course of the game for me. After many turns of science and production, he said, their ship had finally created a super long-range scanner. Why had they done this? Well, this was their interpretation of the research project the president had given them to find us somewhere we could escape from the wolves. I thought, and I think the President also thought, that the Endeavour would just be running simulations about what type of location we needed to find. They would leave the scouting itself to the Aegis. But clearly the scientists here had other ideas. They were now directly scanning for potential jump locations themselves, and had just found their first one. It didn't have a planet in its habitable zone, so it wasn't very promising, but as a proof of concept, this was incredible. This was much more remote than anything the Aegis, and potentially the Wolves, would be able to find. However, on finding it, the chief scientist realized that she was breaking the law. Only the Aegis and the captains of each ship had the right to see the jump coordinates, and she now knew the coordinates of this location and would always know the coordinates of any locations they found, since she was the one who was operating the scanner. The captain of the Endeavour asked me to get the law amended to add the chief scientist to that exemption list. I agreed to do this, but while hearing it, my mind wasn't on that law at all. Endeavour was now getting jump coordinates that could potentially save the entire fleet. But we knew for a fact that Wolf operatives were present in that fleet. They'd blown up one of Gleesa's refineries, they'd probably also split us off from the Star Alpha, and if those wolves were still present when we made the jump, we'd surely be hunted down and killed. The remote nature of the location doesn't matter if you take a traitor with you to it. I saw two possibilities here. Either we eliminate those Wolf operatives, or we split from the fleet. I asked the captain whether he'd informed the Aegis that they'd found this first set of coordinates, and he said he hadn't yet, so together we hatched a contingency plan. I suggested to the captain that he wait until he received one more set of coordinates before telling the Aegis that he'd started getting results. That would mean that the Aegis would always expect one fewer set of coordinates than we actually had, which meant we could hold back whatever the most promising location was, to be known only to the crew of the Endeavour. That way, if we ever needed to, we could make a jump with only the people we trusted. He agreed, and we parted ways as I returned to the council chamber. My amendment about allowing the scientists to see coordinates passed without any issue whatsoever, with everyone in agreement that the President's research plan needed to be continued for morale's sake, even without the President here. But it was mere seconds before we moved on to a much more controversial topic, as the Councillor for Gleesa continued his campaign to wrestle control away from the old world. He suggested that with Wolf operatives active in the fleet and planting bombs, keeping the council chamber in one location was a really bad idea and left us open to planned terrorist attacks. The host ship of the council, he said, should be rotated between ships every turn of the game. The debate around this went on for a little while, with Proxima again backing Gleesa, but then the FAS councillor, the one for the Dion, finally spoke up. And man, did he speak up. Up to this point, he'd been relatively quiet and agreeable basically all the time, repeatedly supporting amendments that had helped others without really pushing anything selfish for himself. His ship had no capacity to supply anyone with anything except security personnel, which they'd freely distributed between the other ships very early on. He knew that the Dion was low priority and had quietly accepted that, up until this point. Now his frustration finally burst forth, and he spoke with fury about how his people were starving, thirsty, his ship had never been repaired from the various attacks, and their morale was through the floor. He'd put the fleet first every step of the way here, and his people had seen no benefit at all. Tear away the last piece of relevance his ship had, the host of the council, and we may as well leave the FAS behind. It was honestly a very good speech. It turned the tables on the votes completely. My vote was previously undecided. I didn't really think that the council chamber location was a very important issue, but after hearing that, I voted against moving it away. It was an odd moment because of course in the briefing, the FAS were my rivals, but in the game they'd been playing with more integrity than almost anyone, and in that moment, that hit me hard. With that vote killed though, it wasn't long before I was back to playing the game. My job was to represent the interests of the Rosal, and the Shepherd's crew had told me to support the no confidence vote. I informed everyone that based on the discussion with my crew, I was switching my vote on that, and with no other opinions having changed, it now passed 4-2. The president was officially deposed.
So, amusing update, we just passed a vote of no confidence in the president because he was lost. And he came back! He walked back into the room right afterwards. Oh my god.
It turned out that the Endeavour had successfully located the president, at which point the Aegis had sent a scout ship out with fuel and coordinates, and the Star Alpha jumped back to our location, allowing the president to walk into the council chamber literal seconds after we passed the resolution to oust him. It was a very awkward moment and a very awkward conversation, but what was done and we stood by our votes. The now ex-president, clearly crestfallen, was escorted out of the chamber as the councillors discussed the format of the resulting election, eventually deciding that it would be one person, one vote across the entire fleet. Each ship would be permitted to put forward one candidate, and whoever won the presidency must select their vice president from the other side of the aisle. So New World must select Old World, or vice versa, just to keep things balanced. I returned to the Shepherd to inform them of this, finding them trading food and water with the Quellon's distributor, so I waited until that was done. Once that distributor had departed, we finally got talking, only for the conversation to be immediately interrupted by an explosion. The shuttle that had just departed our ship had been blown to smithereens, destroying almost all of that round's food and hospitalizing the food distributor. This was all bad news, but the real issue was actually the shuttle itself, because with that explosion, the fleet now only had 4 shuttles in total, one of which was the one we had been hiding and keeping for ourselves. But even more important than that to me, was the question of where that bomb had come from. The shuttle had only travelled between the Quellon and the Shepherd that round. This could only have been planted by someone from one of our 2 ships. I almost immediately headed to the Endeavour to talk with its captain. Our contingency plan had previously been at minimum to bring the Endeavour and the Shepherd. Now it was suddenly looking like bringing the Shepherd might not be a good idea. Without the Shepherd we would be without food generation, so death by wolves would just be replaced with death by starvation. So perhaps this whole thing was the wrong plan after all. But we eventually decided to continue holding back that best set of coordinates. Apart from potential charges of treason, there was nothing stopping us from eventually handing those coordinates over if we really needed to, and holding them back gave us an option of last resort. With that decided, I moved on to discuss the prospect of the presidential election. Endeavour seemed completely uninterested, but Shepherd's crew were actually quite excited about potentially having a Rosal president, and immediately decided to nominate me. I did briefly chat with the Endeavour's captain about them nominating a completely random candidate from another ship to try to split opposing votes, but we eventually decided that that was a bit too over the top and probably wouldn't work anyway, so they just seconded my nomination instead. When the news broadcast began that round, they asked every single electoral candidate to come to the stage, and it turned out there were a lot of them. Not only had every single councillor except the one from the FAS stood, but the former president was standing again, along with the chief medical officer of the Salvador and the captain of the Dion. All the politicians gave quite generic speeches on the broadcast, mostly pitching for unity. But the medical officer and captain both changed up the script. The medical officer was an interesting person who had spent most of the game openly manufacturing space cocaine, and his pitch revolved around the morale boost that distributing said cocaine would give. The captain of the Dion's pitch, however, went down a very different route. He stated that to prove his commitment to unity, he'd be committing to put the Rosal representative in the vice president position. That Rosal representative was me. This was a huge surprise to me, not least because the 2 of us had never spoken. On top of that, Rosal was the rival of the FAS, and the FAS council member didn't particularly like me either. not having forgiven me for sniping the acting president role while he was in the hospital. The captain of the Dion was making a very big and very unexpected political play with this, and it seemed like it worked. When I returned back to the Shepherd, my crewmates immediately suggested that if it ever seemed like I wasn't going to win, we should back the Dion's captain, because that would at least secure me the vice presidency. I had to stop and think for a while here. If it had been the Dion's council member, despite the bad blood between us, I might have gone with it. I felt that that councillor had a very strong sense of integrity and would keep to his agreements. But the fact that it was the captain, and it was such a shrewd political play from someone I hadn't had any chance to assess, made me very cautious about this deal. Despite it being so unexpected though, it still wasn't the thing at the forefront of my mind at this moment. On the way back to the council, I took a quick diversion to the Aegis, not to discuss my political plans, but to try to confirm whether or not a wolf was on the Shepherd. That shuttle bomb had spooked me. It had to have been planted by someone who was either on the Shepherd or the Quellon, and in my mind there was a very obvious way to figure out which it was. I went to the Admiral and suggested that we secretly split the fleet on the next jump. Send half of the ships the coordinates to one location, send half of the ships the coordinates to a different location, and have a trusted person in each group secretly hold coordinates to a third. After that first jump, we see if either half gets ambushed, and then we have both halves jump to the third location and reunite the fleet. He seemed extremely skeptical, but told me that if the council agreed to it, he'd let it happen. I tried to convince him to do it without the council's knowledge, arguing that the more people knew about this plan, the more likely a wolf would know. But he wouldn't budge on this at all, so eventually I left to go to the meeting. When I got to the council, we heard the alarm. Wolf attack. But as per usual, we just got on with our politicking, ignoring the battle outside the window. I pitched my fleet splitting plan, hoping that the wolf fleet outside might make apparent just how badly we needed to find these traitors in our midst. But it was initially met with laughs, people thinking I wasn't being serious. And when I made it clear I was being serious, those laughs turned to suspicion. Nobody was happy with the plan that split the fleet up, and more than that, one councillor even asked me where the plan had originated, saying that it sounded like a wolf strategy to intercept ships that were split from the Aegis. After making it very clear to everyone that it had come directly from me, and trying to explain my reasoning to them, I eventually backed down and gave up. It was clear that this was never going to happen. We pivoted onto the topic of the election, at which point it was raised that whoever won the election should undergo some heavy security checks. I really doubted that this would actually catch a wolf, because surely no wolf would run knowing that they'd have to undergo those checks. But it would at least keep wolf agents away from the presidency, so I ended up supporting it, as did everyone else. The proposal passed easily. At that point, we adjourned the council meeting early because everyone was ready to go on the campaign trail. We were, of course, still stuck on the Dion because of the wolf attack, but we still had people to campaign to, perhaps the most important people to campaign to, because 5 of the 8 candidates were here in this room. The councillor for Proxima and I ended up having a very in-depth conversation in which we found out we both had exactly the same thought. The vote was going to be so split here that any one candidate dropping out and endorsing another could well be enough to secure the win. And we both wanted the presidency to be a New World candidate. It made sense for one of us to drop out and endorse the other. We both agreed in principle. We did not agree on the solution. Both of us wanted the other to drop out. We spent a very long time debating this, during which she was actually really convincing. In this game, she had initially been selfless, up until the point that people started taking advantage of that selflessness. After that, she'd stepped up to take control of the situation and stamp out the corruption that had been destroying the fleet, and she'd done that very effectively. The food situation had improved massively since her ship had taken the distributor role, and she'd also been responsible for wresting the water distributor away from the Lucas. I got the sense that she was being very genuine about her goals in the game, aiming to unite the fleet moving forward and trying to help all of us escape the wolves. That last point specifically, that she was trying to help everyone escape the wolves, flipped a switch in my mind. Because while I'd love to say I was trying to do the same, the truth was that I was just trying to protect myself and the Rosal. I'd made a contingency plan with the Endeavour's captain to essentially run away and throw most of these people to the wolves. And while I'd told myself that it was a plan of last resort, one we'd only use if the fleet hadn't managed to eliminate the wolf operatives, it was always very clearly the one I was going to go with. I only started trying to eliminate wolves when it became apparent that the Shepherd might have a wolf presence, which meant I was just protecting our contingency plan. I wasn't protecting the fleet as a whole. Especially now, with the Admiral and the Council being unwilling to make drastic moves like splitting the fleet, I figured the only way to survive would be to split off. The Rosal suddenly leaving, potentially with the only food source, was going to be bad enough for the fleet's morale without the President going with it. That thought process changed my outlook completely. The fleet needed a President who was going to try to save everyone, and that person wasn't me. I agreed to pull out of the election and support her candidacy instead. We went back to the Shepherd together to inform my crew of my dropping out, but my crew was panicking far too much to listen to us, because as we arrived, most of the rest of the fleet jumped away.
Some more water. Yes, I will.
Okay, so that is an unmanned jump drive. Everyone else in the room is jumping apart from the icebreaker. It seems that there was some miscommunication and my ship is not going with them, which hampers my election plans. I was planning to pull out anyway and support another member of the New World so that the New World managed to get it. They're stuck on my ship as well. They came to talk to me and they got stuck here. Yeah, we have a major issue here because the election is coming up and half the ships are in the wrong place. We can't communicate with them anymore. This is a bit insane. Oh well, we'll see how things go, I guess.
Aegis had sent their communications officer at the start of the round to let everyone know that the fleet was going to jump, but not every crew in the game had been paying attention. The Shepherd and the Icebreaker were now separated from the fleet, floating in the void of space with no defences except the Icebreaker's single fighter squadron. The Councillor from Proxima, having come to my ship to speak to my crew, was now stuck with us, separated both from her people and from the electorate she needed to convince to elect her. We spent the next round only able to talk to people on the Shepherd and people on the Icebreaker. Unable to attend the council meeting, of course, we set up our own in a room on the Icebreaker, just myself, the Proxima Councillor and the Councillor for the CPA. No matter who won the election, the Vice President had to be selected from the other side of the new Old World divide, so the Proxima Councillor made her pitch to the CPA, drop out in favour of her, and she'd select him as the Vice President. The CPA agreed, and with that the three of us had a pact. On the eve of the election, we would go to the news and announce our dropping out and backing her. I returned to my ship, with both the Icebreaker and the Shepherd preparing to make the jump. It was clear my crew wasn't happy about me dropping out of the election, especially since they didn't know about my contingency plan, so I couldn't give them my real reasoning for this. And they were doubly angry because I hadn't secured any firm promises at all in return for dropping out. To them it just looked like I caved in for no reason. They really wanted Rosal to have more power here, and suggested that if I was going to drop out, I should endorse the player who wanted to give me the Vice President role, the Captain of the Dion. But I refused to do this, instead sticking to the deal I'd just made. Thankfully, we were then able to jump to reunite with the fleet with no issues, the only cost being losing a phase of food distribution and discussion. In retrospect, I wonder if that lost phase actually ended up being a good thing. It allowed us three councillors to unite solidly as a group, and in an alternative world where the Shepherd made the jump and that phase was full of politicking, maybe that wouldn't have been the case. My crew really wanted me to back the Dion's captain, and the main thing holding me back from doing so was that I never spoke to him. Maybe there's an alternate reality where I spent that phase making that deal. That reality could have been disastrous. Because unknown to all of us, the captain of the Dion was one of the 3 Wolf operatives. While the FAS council member had earlier been correct that his people had been deprived of water and food, he'd been pointing his finger the wrong way. Food and water had made it onto the Dion, especially after the Lucas lost water distribution, but the supplies were always mostly destroyed by its captain, with only tiny rations being handed out to its population. While the rest of the fleet was now in somewhat good shape, the Dion's morale was so low that it was just a nudge away from total rioting. And that nudge was about to happen. The former vice president was now acting president until the election, and chaired the council meeting, in which we managed to get one issue sorted. After spending the entire game making sure that the Shepherd had kept its shuttle, I now finally gave that shuttle up, knowing that we needed something to transport food, and ultimately, that was more important than keeping it under Rosal control. But after unanimously passing that, the council meeting suddenly moved on to a topic that got a lot more intense. The councillor for Gleaser stood up to raise a point of order. He revealed that Refinery 124's investigation into the bombing on board had concluded. The origin of the bomb traced back to the Star Alpha, and the vice president had made a visit to Refinery just prior. The vice president was utterly stunned and seemingly speechless. But even if he wanted to respond to the accusations, he didn't have time, because at that moment, the council chamber exploded. In retrospect, it was probably not a good idea to have 5 of the 8 electoral candidates sitting in one room where everyone knew we would be. We'd made ourselves an easy target, and were it not for pure dumb luck, that there could have been the end of my story. Mechanically, we each had to make a death roll, and by some miracle, every single council member survived, with only the Gleaser councillor seriously wounded and being immediately taken to the Salvador for treatment. Unfortunately, the same couldn't be said for the FAS citizenry inhabiting the parts of the ship adjacent to the chamber, and chaos very soon broke out. A full-scale evacuation of the council members quickly followed, with the Dion security escorting us to escape pods and sending us back to our respective ships. As we left, we made a pact. We would not surrender to terrorists here. The election was scheduled for this phase, and we would not delay it, even with the Gleaser candidate hospitalized. No bombing was going to stop the democratic process. I tried going to the news to ask for a slot to announce my dropping out, but I'd forgotten just how uncooperative the political correspondent was. He wouldn't do what any politician wanted, even at the best of times, and through election season he had adopted a no-bias rule, which he'd taken to the extreme. He outright refused to give politicians slots on the news this close to the election. I could see the logic there, so I eventually just asked that instead of letting me on the news, he just announce my withdrawal and support for the Proxima candidate himself, something that he again refused to guarantee. An argument very quickly ensued, as I tried to point out that my withdrawal from the election was definitely something that should be announced in the news broadcast. Impartiality rules shouldn't stop you from reporting on the truth. He was stubborn as a mule though, and to my annoyance, I got no guarantee whatsoever.
Alright, so I'm going to withdraw from the election in favour of Naomi, who is from the Quellon ship, Proxima. We'll see how that goes. It's going to be interesting. I tried to go to the news to announce it, and they were very uncooperative. Yeah. Other backup plan, I'm a little worried that someone on my ship might be a wolf, because they did, like a shuttle going from there did blow up. But I feel like that's a bit too obvious, right? They wouldn't blow up a shuttle going from our ship if they were on our ship. I think Operation Get Out of Here Separately as a last resort is very much still on the cards. We just need to get enough fuel to make the jump.
As the phase concluded and the news report began, I was incredibly relieved to hear the political correspondents announce the withdrawals of my own candidacy and that of the CPA councillors, and our new backing of Proxima. Panic over. The election itself immediately followed, a vote that the Proxima councillor won in an absolute landslide, receiving 45% of the votes when no other candidate even cleared 20. She quickly selected the councillor for the Icebreaker, the CPA one, as her vice president, and just like that, our fleet had new leadership.
I guess now's as good a time for an update as ever. The Kelon council member has been elected president after myself and the council member from the Icebreaker withdrew from the election at the last minute through our support behind her. The Icebreaker council member has been made the vice president. I didn't get anything strictly from that agreement apart from favour on the council. We'll see how that goes. The other plan in action is potentially to jump the Endeavour away. We're trying to figure out whether we will do that right now. Which ship we'll use, whether we'll bring the Shepherd with us or leave them behind. There are a lot of people on that ship. It will be hard to mask their trail. So we'll see how that goes.
I'd gone to talk to the crew members of the Endeavour over this team phase, asking them once again about the contingency plan. Apparently it was now ready to go. The chief scientist had developed a jump scrambler, something absolutely vital for making sure the wolves couldn't follow us. If another ship jumped somewhere else, we could use the scrambler to mask our trail behind that ship's, meaning a trace would show that we jumped to that location instead of the one we actually jumped to. There was one major downside though. While it was very likely to work for a small ship like the Endeavour, its effectiveness on a large ship's trail, like the Shepherd's, was currently unknown. This was a source of great debate. Right now we weren't even sure we wanted to jump away, especially if we took the Shepherd, we'd be leaving the fleet without a food source. And if we didn't take the Shepherd, we'd be leaving ourselves without a food source. The Endeavour had found a location that had sources of water, but that wasn't a guarantee that food could be grown there. And this was all putting aside the fact that if we took the Shepherd and a Wolf operative was on board, we'd certainly be found and eliminated, especially since we had no weapons on either ship. This discussion went round and round and round again in circles, and we didn't come to a conclusion. With the council meeting about to start, I quickly asked whether the Endeavour needed anything from me, especially now that I had the President's favour. The captain made it very clear they needed food and water. It turned out that despite the fleet getting their supply issues mostly sorted out, with the previous president out and his plan now less prominent, Endeavour was very low on the priority list and often didn't get what it needed for morale. I very quickly popped over to the Quelon to ask their food distributor to make a stop at the Endeavour and give them what they needed. He was extremely uncooperative though, repeatedly telling me that everyone was in need and the Endeavour needed to make do with what it received. Even pointed out that I had the president's favour and that I'd supported his ship's candidate for the presidency, didn't shift him on this. I was about to give up completely and go to the council chamber when I spotted something rather interesting. The chief medical officer from the Salvador, the one who had run for the presidency with the slogan "Space Cocaine for All," had a shuttle and was collecting food directly from the Shepherd. He clearly had some agreement with one of the Shepherd's crew members because they were handing it directly to him. But what they were doing was against the law, only the food distributor had the right to do that. I very quickly rushed over, telling him I'd seen what he was doing, but that I wouldn't mention it to anyone if he also used that shuttle to drop off some of the food at the Endeavour. He very quickly agreed, and did so. I then raced to the council meeting, coming in very late. The council had been moved to a small room on the Icebreaker, a location known only to those in attendance after the previous bombing, and it was clear that even if we wanted to go back to the Dion, we wouldn't be able to. It was the topic being discussed as I entered, and the situation there was dire. The Dion had been on almost no morale, and the council chamber bombing was the final straw for its people. Riots had broken out all over the ship, damaging most of its vital systems, and the security forces had been unable to do anything but evacuate most of the ship's crew. Now the vast majority of the FAS populace was stuck on an immobile ship that would not be able to follow the fleet. The FAS council member was trying to set up evacuations of his people onto the other ships, but there was a timer on this because our last FTL jump had been a very short one. We needed to move again, basically at the end of next turn, or the Armada would catch us, and there was no way to take the Dion with us. Anyone left there when we jumped would be left to the wolves. Most people agreed to help, and indeed, outside the council room, many of the shuttles were already being used to do exactly that, ferrying as many of the civilians away from the Dion as possible, and rehoming the refugees on other ships. The first officer of the Dion had stayed on their ship to lead these efforts, while the captain had been relocated to the Aegis to help with military command. Not knowing that a wolf was now on the Aegis itself, the president's second agenda item was to have the former vice president arrested by the Aegis's crew. Refinery 124's investigation had concluded that he was a wolf operative, so we unanimously voted for this resolution. Little did we know that one vote would lead to a cataclysmic chain of events. Before that chain even started though, I returned to the Shepherd, to find that my crew were now somehow in possession of another shuttle. I was surprised by this, given that the few remaining shuttles were either requisitioned for distributors or evacuating the Dion, but they explained this was the Dion's shuttle. They'd managed to barter control of it from the Dion in return for their assistance in the evacuation. I then darted back to the Endeavour to discuss our contingency plan. They were happy that I'd managed to get them the food. I didn't mention that it was through blackmail, but that joy was very quickly erased when they heard that the fleet would soon be jumping. The time was now. We needed to make the decision on whether to pull the trigger and split from the fleet. And so started a long discussion between myself, the captain, and the chief scientist. We were all convinced that there were more wolves around than just the vice president, and at this stage, all three of us believed that in order to survive, Rosal would need to part ways with the fleet. The controversial question, though, was whether or not to take the Shepherd. The captain did not want to do so, saying that even if we managed to mask the Shepherd's tracks, everything we'd have done would be for nothing if a single wolf was on board that ship. The chief scientist had the opposite view. We couldn't abandon so many of our own people. The Endeavour itself had just a skeleton crew and the scientists were mostly Proxima prisoners from Vulcan who had been retrained. It was still a large number of people, but it was tiny compared to the entire colony's worth of Rosal civilians aboard the Shepherd. This discussion went round in circles so much that a council meeting was announced, so we agreed that we'd decide on it at the end of the round, just before the jump. But it was clear that the captain was dead set on leaving the Shepherd behind, and at the end of the day, the captain was the one with control of the ship. It wasn't hard to guess what he would eventually decide on. I left the Endeavour with a very clear idea in my mind, one that I felt gave us our best chance of survival, but which I hadn't shared with the captain or the chief scientist for fear that they would find it horrifically immoral. The whole reason we were doing this was that none of us had any confidence that the fleet would survive the wolves in the long run. In my mind at least, that meant that by activating this plan, we were putting the future of the human race in Endeavour's hands, and Endeavour's hands only. We had to ensure its success through any means necessary, even if that meant accelerating the deaths of the compatriots we were leaving behind. My plan was to hijack the Shepherd's shuttle. I'd duck out of the council as early as I could, return to the Shepherd, and load their shuttle with as much of the Shepherd's food, water, and fuel as I could, and then head straight for the Endeavour. If we were going to jump without any supply ships, we at least needed supplies. Was it justified? Perhaps in the future, when they told tales of the survivor fleet, I'd be the coward who crippled it to run away. But in my eyes, if I didn't do this, nobody would survive to tell those tales at all. I entered the council chamber to the FAS councillor, informing everyone that about 40% of his ship's civilians had managed to evacuate. There was general agreement in the room that no matter who was left on the ship at the end of this round, we were going to have to jump away. And that was when disaster struck. Wolf attack. We'd all become so used to sitting here and politicking while the battles raged that nobody else even reacted to this. But for me, this one was different. I was now trapped on the icebreaker until the battle subsided. I couldn't reach the Endeavour, and that meant I was panicking. Every moment I was trapped here was another moment in which the Endeavour might jump away. As we continued talking, there was enough commotion in the other room that it actually began to turn heads. This clearly wasn't a normal attack. Something else was going on. I slipped out of the meeting and into the icebreaker's corridor to ask Council Control, our game master, if there was any way I could attempt to get back to the Endeavour. And as I waited for a response, an announcement shocked the entire fleet.
Okay, there is a wolf attack ongoing. I'm stuck on the council ship. The Aegis just jumped without us. We are on the icebreaker right now. I need to get back to the Endeavour before they make that jump, or I will not go with them. Theoretically, being on this ship is fine because it's with the rest of the fleet, but I trust in the contingency plan more. Oh.
To understand why the Aegis jumped, we need a perspective that isn't stuck in the council chamber. Let's rewind a bit back to before the wolf attack, when the Vice President leaves the council meeting. He's just received orders from the new president to ensure the arrest of the previous Vice President. He travels to the Aegis, where he meets with the Admiral and issues an order, not just to arrest the ex-Vice President, but to detain the entire crew of the Star Alpha, just to be safe. The Admiral begins relaying that order to his crew, a crew that since the evacuation of the Dion, now includes the Dion's captain. Upon hearing this, that captain radios an emergency signal to the Star Alpha, telling his fellow Wolf operative on board exactly what's about to happen. That Wolf operative is not, in fact, the ex-Vice President. Both the President and Vice President were totally innocent, but their Secretary of State was not. This man had been hiding in the shadows behind the much higher profile President and VP, but it was he who had delivered the bomb to Refinery 124 he'd visited alongside the Vice President, and now it was he who was about to make his move. The Secretary of State races to the Star Alpha's bridge, shooting the unsuspecting pilot and taking control of the ship. When the Aegis issues its communication telling the ship to surrender, the ex-Vice President and the ex-President attempt to get to the bridge to respond, but find its doors firmly locked. As they try to batter them down, the ship turns, heading in the direction of the Aegis at accelerating speed. Ramming speed. At exactly this moment, the Wolf Armada's vanguard jumps into the system, only a small part of the Wolf Armada itself, but a much greater force than the fleet has fought before. And in the sudden chaos, only one ship sees and reacts to the Star Alpha's movement. That ship is Refinery 124. In that moment, Refinery's captain has a split-second decision to make. His ship has no weapons. There's no easy way for him to take the Star Alpha down, unless he uses his ship itself.
If the Aegis goes down, we all do. Move to intercept.
The prison ship Vulcan tries to fight off the incoming wolf attack alongside the remaining fighters from the Dion and the Icebreaker, while the Aegis prepares to fire all its weapons at the Star Alpha. Unfortunately for the Aegis, that ship is the President's vessel. It's both nimble and surprisingly tanky, and what little parts of the barrage manage to hit it don't even manage to get through its shields. Star Alpha is aiming to ram right into the Aegis's bridge, and Aegis can do nothing about it. The Admiral sees Refinery moving to intercept and realizes he has just two options now. He can bet on Refinery managing to block and take the hit, but that's a risky bet. In that moment, he decides on the second option.
Emergency jump, now!
Aegis jumps out of the system, leaving the fleet to fight off the Wolf attack without its flagship. The Admiral thinks that the rest of the fleet will just follow, because he's jumped to coordinates set as the fleet's next destination. But lost in the chaos was the fact that the communications officer hadn't yet sent those coordinates out. As far as the rest of the ships were concerned, Aegis had just abandoned them. The crew of Refinery 124 have very little time to realise that their act of total selflessness and sacrifice now has no purpose at all. An explosion occurs as Star Alpha and Refinery collide, the Star Alpha being blown to smithereens and Refinery being completely immobilized. But the Star Alpha is only the beginning of this fight. The Wolf ships are now everywhere. Vulcan is trying to take the place of the Aegis, but it's a prison ship, not a military one. There's only so much its weapons can do. The Dion had been left at the back of the fleet, quickly becoming a focus of the Wolf forces. Initially, the fighter squadron rallies around the Dion, trying to protect their people to the last, but the first officer, realizing it's a lost cause, orders them to protect the Vulcan instead. The Dion goes down in a series of explosions, killing the first officer and everyone else left on board. The Wolf ships then turn towards the Quellon. The captain, knowing their ship has no defenses, follows the example of the Aegis and issues a command to emergency jump. But the Quellon has no set coordinates to jump to. Despite heavy protests from its first officer, the Quellon jumps to random coordinates, ending up lost in deep space. Back on the icebreaker, I'm now in a complete panic. Control has refused my request to leave the ship. Essentially, the icebreaker is on lockdown and the escape pods are guarded. I have no way off, and I know that I'm about to miss my ride. The Endeavour wants to jump right after another ship to mask its trail. Would they really wait for me? Especially considering I was advocating for leaving everyone else. The answer is no. Seeing its opportunity, Endeavour jumps out of the system, masking its trail behind that of the Quellons, and leaving me behind. I'm devastated, but I hardly have time to come to terms with this because the next target of the Wolves is us. The Vulcan is shooting down everything it can, but plenty of Wolf ships are still intact and they're now beelining directly towards the icebreaker. An icebreaker can't follow the other ships' examples because it doesn't have enough fuel to make the jump. Thinking they have no other option, the captain of the icebreaker issues a very risky command. A ship can technically attempt an FTL jump without enough fuel, but doing so has a very high risk of failure, and if it fails, the consequences can be disastrous. And that's exactly what happens. The council chamber is rocked by a massive shockwave as the engine explodes, leaving the council members cowering as we watch the incoming Wolf ships approaching our now immobile vessel. We're sitting ducks, and our fate seems certain.
We're not leaving you, Icebreaker, for the fleet!
The Lucas, despite also having no weapons, positions itself directly between us and the Wolf forces, shielding us from the force of their firepower. We can do nothing but watch as Wolf boarding ships divert course, docking with the Lucas directly in front of our eyes. And so begins the final struggle. Under normal circumstances, the Lucas would be completely overwhelmed, but it was the primary ship taking in refugees from the Dion in the previous round. As a result, it now has many of the FAS security forces on board. Together they barricade the corridors of the ship, fighting desperately to hold the Wolves back. They're just about able to stop the advance, but there's no way they can hold the tide back forever. The Vulcan, realizing there's no hope of defeating this entire fleet, pivots and charges directly at the Wolf's Vanguard capital ship, focusing all fire on it. It's heavily shielded and extremely tanky. It would take an absolute miracle for the Vulcan to take this thing down. And a miracle is exactly what happens. The Vulcan's barrage detonates a warhead that the Wolf capital ship was in the process of firing. The explosion carries to the ammo bay, causing a massive chain reaction that detonates the entire ship. And just like that, the tides turn. Seeing their supposedly invincible capital ship go down, the Wolf fighters begin to flee before the Vulcan, warping out and leaving the boarding parties behind. The SAN and FAS aboard the Lucas rally and make a final push, taking advantage of the Wolf's loss of morale as they see their forces flee. The momentum carries the SAN and FAS, managing against seemingly insurmountable odds to rout the Wolves completely. We had survived. But was it really a triumph? There was no celebration. The Aegis, the Quellon, the Endeavour, and the Salvador had vanished into the darkness, with no coordinates left behind to follow. The Dion and the Star Alpha were completely destroyed. Refinery 124 and Icebreaker were immobilized, and the Lucas was badly damaged. The prison ship Vulcan was in better shape, but it was damaged too. In all this, there was only one ship that was completely untouched. The Shepherd had been at the front of the fleet and the Wolf forces hadn't engaged it at all. It was in complete working order. And more importantly to me, the Endeavour's chief scientist hadn't wanted to leave it behind. Maybe there was a chance. The moment I was permitted to leave the Icebreaker, I rushed straight to the Shepherd, trying to get any news I could about the Endeavour. Did they leave any coordinates? Could we follow? The answers were both very definite no's, and my heart sank.
Okay, so Wolf attack just happened. There was a lot going on that round. Basically we had, initially the Aegis jumped out, then we had the Endeavour jump out. I was desperately trying to get back to the Endeavour. You are not allowed to move during a Wolf attack because you're stuck on your ship. I went and asked Control, look, is there any tiny ship I can get into to attempt to slip back? I don't care if I have a death roll, I just want to get back. They would not let me do it. So I was stuck on the Icebreaker and I heard the Endeavour jump away. So there goes contingency plan. I'm now stuck with the fleet. I've got to hope Endeavour made it and they can continue to rebuild somewhere. We will see. Oh my god. Icebreaker has a damaged jump drive. It's going to be really difficult to jump. Shepherd is still in good repair, but we have no coordinates. No one gave us the coordinates, and I didn't think to grab one from Endeavour before it jumped away. Endeavour and Aegis have all of them. This is a nightmare.
But at that moment, hope arrived. A faint Rosal encrypted signal was received by the Shepherd. No other ship would be able to decrypt this. And in that message, coordinates. Alongside the message, trust no one else, bring no one else. The Shepherd once again had an unmanned jump drive that round, meaning even if it got the coordinates from the Endeavour before the fight, it wouldn't have been able to jump. But manning the jump drive now would enable us to jump at the beginning of the following round. The Endeavour was taking a massive risk by sending us this. We could probably jump before the Armada arrived, but the Endeavour had the Scrambler and the Shepherd did not. This jump could be traced. Should we really follow? Should we put the Endeavour in danger to save our own lives? If I was truly committed to the greater good, I'd have said no. They escaped, and humanity's future had hopefully escaped with them. But it's so much easier to consider the greater good when you're not having to sacrifice yourself. We manned the jump drive and began preparations to leave. At which point, the new council member from Proxima arrived at the ship, trying to get me to join an emergency council session aboard the Icebreaker. I'd already been left behind once, I wasn't going to let this happen again. I refused to leave my ship, saying that they should count Rosal as abstaining from any and all votes. This obviously raised suspicions, and he would not take no for an answer, eventually spotting that we'd manned the jump drive. When he finally departed, the rumour very quickly spread around the rest of the fleet. Shepherd is about to jump. The next few minutes were a commotion of officers of various ships docking with the Shepherd and trying to convince us to give them whatever coordinates we had. We continuously denied having any, recalling the Shepherd's message, "Trust no one." Nobody bought this, and there was an uneasy atmosphere as they finally returned to their ships. I got a very strong impression that they were about to turn the Vulcan against us and force us to hand them over. I dashed to the bridge to tell the captain we needed to jump right now. Or at least, I tried to. As I ran through the ship, I was accosted by the Shepard's own security team, restrained and handcuffed. Despite my protests, I was thrown into a storage hold, locked up in a makeshift cell on my own ship, by my own people. And then they read the charges. High treason against the fleet and against the Rosal. The Rosal think I'm a wolf. After I withdrew from the presidential election, Shepard received a communication from the Quellon requesting that they run a security check against me. It stated that there were suspicions I'd withdrawn to avoid the background checks a winning presidential candidate would have to undergo. When they investigated, they mostly found what they expected, records of my being a civil servant back on Rosal. But there was one striking irregularity. A 2-year gap in my records, right in the middle of my career. No details of any work done on Rosal, no details of travel to any other system, no record at all of my activities or where I may have been over that time. They double-checked and then triple-checked, but that just confirmed their fears. The records didn't exist. Could those 2 years have been a voyage to Wolf 1061C? With that question at the forefront of their minds, suddenly many more arose. A shuttle had been detonated when leaving the Shepherd shortly after I'd arrived. Could that bomb have been one I planted? I'd emerged from the council bombing completely unharmed. Could that have been my own doing? In the final battle, the Shepherd had been completely untouched. Could that have been the Wolves assuming I was there and preparing to extract their operative? The clinching piece of evidence for them, though, had been my conversation with the Admiral of the Aegis, my efforts to convince him to split up the fleet. My reasoning had been that we needed to find the Wolf operatives, but could the actual reason have been to try to separate the Aegis from the very vessels it needed to protect? Would a Wolf really have been so blatant in trying to divide and conquer? It seemed unthinkable at the time, but now? Not so much. The captain of the Dion selecting me as his vice presidential candidate without even talking to me, could that have been a wolf selecting a wolf? Maybe my refusal to back him was a fear of having 2 wolves undergo those security checks. Perhaps my desperation to get aboard the Endeavour had less to do with my own survival, and more to do with tracking down other survivors. Once one piece of evidence appears, there's suddenly a cascade. I think I felt us jump. I don't know if we found the Endeavour. Perhaps outside these very walls is the wolf-free utopia we've all been searching for, a new home for the Rosal. But even if it is, I might never see it. The punishment for high treason is death. This account is a full description of everything I did and why I did it. My final, desperate attempt to make you understand that you're making a mistake. Someone deleted 2 years of my records and sent you a communique, and that was enough for you to join unconnected dots to make them vaguely resemble the shape of a wolf. I'm one of you. I may not have been a paragon of virtue, but I'm Rosal through and through. I beg you, please, don't let your paranoia take away my future. As I put down this pen, I'm accepting that I've done everything I can do. My life is no longer in my own hands. It's now in yours. I pray you make the right decision.
The Endeavour arrived at its destination to find exactly what we'd seen on the scan. A world Earth-like enough to sustain life, but alien in almost every way. Even now, we're still trying to learn how best to survive here, but we're thankful we found anywhere to survive at all. We sent the Shepherd coordinates that were in our sector but not in our system. Our plan had been to monitor its jump and see if the wolves followed. If they had managed to escape detection, we could send them the true coordinates of New Eden. They disappeared from our radar one day after they made the jump. After a week of no response, we sent the Endeavour on one last voyage to find them and bring them home. Our fears were confirmed when we found the shepherd. It was nothing but space debris, hunted down and destroyed by Wolf forces. A lifeless husk, floating in the void of space. Upon our return, the Endeavour was dismantled. We gave up the stars and made our home here, where the wolves will never find us. But in those same stars we'll immortalise those we lost along the way. Humanity's salvation. The Survivor Fleet.